Whenever people talk about the supposed conflict between science and faith, sooner or later they talk about the trial of Galileo, the heroic scientist persecuted by the Christian Church because he stood up for the truth. The facts are different. They involve politics and personality conflicts, as well as questions of science. Galileo had a gift for making enemies. He enjoyed making people look small. He made scientific claims that went beyond the evidence. He ignored a warning not to teach the sun-centered system, and he offended the most powerful politician in Europe at the time, the Pope. Galileo was put on trial in Rome in 1633. Sure enough, he was found guilty. And then, so the story goes, he was put in prison and tortured, and according to some people, even executed.
Well, much of the popular version of the story of Galileo is either hyperbole or just completely wrong. The elements that are usually completely, that are said that are completely wrong would be that he was imprisoned, which he never was, that he was tortured, which he never was, or that he was even executed. I've even seen that.
Nobody is going to torture Galileo. He's too famous. And there's another very, very, very important reason that we always forget in the Galileo case. Galileo may have been outrageous and abusive scientifically, but he was born, lived and died a devout Roman Catholic. Galileo said, wrote or imagined anything that challenged the resurrection, the virgin birth, the status of the Virgin Mary, God, the creation, salvation, judgment. Galileo questions none of that. He's as clean as a whistle, theologically. What they got him for was teaching what he couldn't prove and disobeying a restriction placed on him in 1616 not to teach us the truth before he could prove it. I've described Galileo's heresy as of a parking ticket standard. Heresy in the Renaissance Church could vary greatly. It could be rather like Giordano Bruno in 1600, a real rip, snorting heresy, denying God, denying Pope, denying virtually everything. That will get you burned as sure as cats meow. There's no doubt about that. That will get you burned. Galileo wasn't saying that. Galileo was simply teaching a theory that he couldn't prove as a fact. And what the church did to him effectively was a slap on the wrist. You can get an idea of that too, because after the trial, he went on holiday to Siena, not very far away from Rome. Who did he stay with? He stayed with the Archbishop of Siena, one of his great friends, Asciano Piccolomini. You imagine, you've just supposedly been put on trial in Rome, and you're going putting your feet in the Archbishop's palace in Siena. That is proven, documented fact. He then went back to live at his estate, yes, under sort of restriction at Arcetri, near Florence.
Galileo was put on trial by the Inquisition. He wasn't tortured. He wasn't, as far as we know, even shown the instruments of torture, and I'm not sure where that idea comes from. But he was convicted because he was quite clearly guilty of supporting Copernicus in a way which was contrary to how he had been instructed to behave. I have very little doubt, although I don't particularly like this fact, that if Galileo had refused to recant, then he would have been in a great deal of trouble and could potentially have been executed. But he did recant, and as a result he was placed under a fairly comfortable house arrest for the rest of his life. But it's interesting to note that his most important science, the Dialogue on Two New Sciences, was actually written after his trial, and it seems that once he was required to settle down and stop trying to be a public figure, he was able to do his most important work.
Galileo was put on trial, and he was found guilty, but he wasn't executed, he wasn't tortured, he wasn't even put in prison. He was placed under house arrest, where he could carry on with his scientific work until he died naturally in 1642. The myth of the trial of Galileo is a mixture of exaggerations and outright untruths, often pushed by people who haven't made any effort to find out the facts. Next time, we'll look at what happened in the conflict between science and faith in the generations after Galileo.